Pan-Africanism and Academia, the World of African Heritage Studies Association, and Dr. Henrik Clark. The organization grew out of an event at the 1968 meeting of the Association for African Studies in Los Angeles. Led by Dr. John Clark, researchers of African descent demand change in AHSA's Eurocentric approach to African studies and the marginalization of researchers of African descent. Due to the AHSA's failures to reform, academics of African descent occupied the 1969 AHSA annual meeting in Montreal with the support of academics from around the world. Following the 1969 occupation, the African Descent Concerned incorporated to the African Heritage Studies Association in New York in 1969 following a meeting at the Federal City College. Dr. John Henrik Clark was the founder-president of the African Heritage Studies Association, and James Turner, Leonard Jeffries, Shelby Lewis Smith, Nicola Enyewu, and Edward Scobie were among the founders directors of the organization. The first annual African Heritage Studies Association was held at Howard Universities in 1970. Every year, a conference is organized. It is important to note that the African Heritage Study Association successfully challenged the Association for African Studies' right to serve as the official United States delegation to the 1973 International Association of Africanists in Addis Ababa. The challenge culminated in the selection of Dr. John Henrik Clark, president of the African Heritage Studies Association, to lead a joint African Heritage Study Association for African Studies delegation. The birth of the African Heritage Studies Association. The African Heritage Studies Association was born out of a conflict with the Association of African Studies. The conflict took place in Montreal in 1969. For its critique, the African Heritage Studies Association was seen as a threat to the Afrocentrism in academia. Afrocentrism is a social construction at the intersection of academia and politics, but also religion and the arts. In 1969, academia was divided on the issue of Black studies. African American students wanted to create a Black studies program in the history of the United States and the world. Caribbean and African American students showed their discontent in Montreal to fight against institutional racism. What happened to the birth of the African Heritage Studies Association? For this, we have to go back to 1968, a year back. In 1968, the Association of African Studies held uh, his annual meeting in Los Angeles. It was early 1,500 members and more than 3,000 affiliate institutions composed mainly of people of European origin. In other words, white people only. Researchers and scholars of African descent, members of the Association of African Studies, emerged by calling themselves the Black Caucus. They asked the Association for greater integration of Afro-descendants in scientific issues dealing with the issue of African and African descent, since they have the knowledge of their community. These demands were brought to the Association of African Studies by the Dr. John Henry Clark. A scheduled working meeting between the Black Caucus and the Association of African Studies is cancelled. This cancellation is one more scandal. The Black Caucus changed its name to the African Heritage Studies Association. The group then decided to boycott the October 1969 AHSA meeting in Montreal. Senegalese Ambassador Gabriel Darbusier and African Heritage Studies Association members took to the stage at the conference. Dr. John Henry Clark and other members of African Heritage Studies Association argued that the Association of African Studies continued to violate African society and perpetuate colonialism. We suspect that it is a new era of academic colonialism, and that is not unrelated to neocolonialism that is trying to reserve Africa by controlling the mind of Africa. It is the citation of Dr. John Henry Clark. The functional committees for African Studies of African Heritage Studies Association include Leonard Jeffries, who will soon become the head of the New York City College Black Studies Department. Harold Weaver, educator at the Center for African Studies of St. John University, and who will become the chair of Rutledge College Program in African Art Studies. Shelby Lewis, assistant professor at the Department of Political Sciences of Southern University, Baton Rouge, in Louisiana, and today professor emeritus at Clark College in Atlanta, Georgia. Chike Ongwachi, a Nigerian future director of the African Studies Research Program at Howard University. Neil Painter, then a master's student in anthropology at the University of California, Los Angeles, and today a retired professor from Princeton. Mike Shirless, then an activist educator in Washington, today retired professor of history of Augusta State University, Georgia. John Henry Clark, instructor for Harlem-based organization, RU Act at that time, who will become the first chair of the Black and Puerto Rican Studies Department at Hunter College, New York. The demand of the African Heritage Studies Association, Black Caucus. The group demands that the study of Africa be undertaken from a Pan-Africanist or Afrocentric perspective, which defines that all African are which defines that all blacks are African people and denies the tribalization of African people by geographical demarcation on the basis of colonialist sphere of influence. The African Heritage Studies Association called for racial parity within the African Studies Association called for the creation for a new committee composed by 6 African and 6 European. This demand requires a new constitution of the AHSA to integrate the members of the African Heritage Studies Association. The resolution to implement a new constitution was overturned on the pretext that the Black Caucus demanded a black story. Belgian professor Van den Berg, then a professor at the University of Washington and a specialist in the studies of African ethnic relations, accused the African Heritage Studies Association of being an apartheid association acting in the logic of racial conflict. Political scientist James Turner and Rukudzo Murapa condemned the arrogance of white scholarship, the exclusion of black women in the history of Africa. Here we have the documentation about the Black Caucus and the explanation of the creation of the Black Caucus. After Montreal, the African Heritage Studies Association became an independent organization. During the first meeting at Howard University in early 1960s, 4 panels of reflection were defined. First, the African cultural heritage reappraised. 2. New Pan-Africanism from a political perspective. 3. Black studies and the struggle for Black education. 4. New perspective on the history of African peoples. Afrocentrism, this concept that is scary. In the early 1970s, Onwachike defined the Africanism is doing a new definition. The main goal for African in the Africanism is to build a being, a human being, a future, and a philosophy that is free in both letter and spirit. It presupposes an African theoretical framework devoid of any Western connotation. The polemical debate of the 1990s in America and European academic cycle. For the African scientists, it's the need to change the orientation of African studies from an external and Eurocentric perspectives to an internal and African one. It's really important. The Afrocentrism is really important for academics as Molefi Asante Maulana Karenga, Marimba Ani, and Theophile Obenga. Critics have focused on only a few arguments, like the darkness of the Egyptians or the psychological understanding of race and melanin. Among the main opponents are Mary Lefkowitz, Clarence Walker, Stephen Howe, and François-Xavier Fauvel-Aymar. Early articles use the phrases Afrocentric ideas or ideologies to discuss the work of Dr. John Henry Clarke and the African Heritage Studies Association. Scholar activist. Within the ideological framework of the African Heritage Studies Association, Dr. John Henry Clarke insists on the central figure of the organization, the scholar activist. The African Heritage Studies Association members are described as a collective of scholar activists who inscribe their position as intellectuals in social reality and political action. As a result, the militant academic becomes a Pan-Africanist activist who is the custodian of Black militancy. African Heritage Studies Association members are considered as children or cousins of Webb Dubois, Marcus Garvey, George Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, and Julius Nyerere. Walter Rodney depends his reflection by constructing a real typology of the type of intellectual necessary for the liberation of Black and by advocating for multi-faced intellectuals. 1. The historian who lays the foundation. 2. The political activist who is on the side of action. 3. The scientist who is an intellectual with great pedagogical abilities. The activist, the scientist, is an activist researcher. The African American Organic Intellectual. The African American Organic Intellectual is opposed traditional intellectual rise in a traditional intellectual environment as seen as disinterest and rising in the name of reason and true above sectarian or new interest. They are linked to their institution and their societal order. African American organic intellectuals were not trained in traditional university, but they have a critical understanding of their world and communicate their ideas to the public. These intellectuals are trained on the street, politically involved in search of community liberation, and they are the beneficiaries of the Black tradition in history that has developed outside academia, who follows this benefit through the teeth of knowledge by traditional intellectuals. The opposition and role of organic intellectuals is completely accepted in the Black and activist community. And now I propose a biography about this topic.